When animating the walk cycle, it's useful to have some version of a template. And you can find any number of templates or guides for walk cycles to follow. And if you want to do something that's non-humanoid, dog, cat, elephant, giraffe, it really is useful to go find a walk cycle sequence to use as some version of a tracing or animation template. When we're doing frame by frame, it's a little more on the tracing side. When we're doing it with shapes and rigged characters, it's more of just an animation guide. But after that, we'll notice that for each drawing, as I've drawn through, paying attention to the front leg, the next frame as we work this out is now the front leg is going to bend, because with the front leg and the back leg straight, we've effectively completed half of the walk cycle. So now what we really need are the next three in between. This frame, and this frame. And now that gives me the frames that I need to complete my walk cycle. Now as I look at these drawings here, they don't line up. And this is where I now need to start modifying them so that we're lining up each of the individual drawings so that it will be able to create an animation cycle. So to do this, we have a couple of different things that we can work with doing. Is I can move to the next frame, and what we're trying to do is create the illusion of our character effectively walking in place on a treadmill, and then we will be able to animate them moving across the screen using a peg. Because if we do it this way, it gives us significantly more flexibility on both timing as well as animation without having to redraw as many things in our project. So now when I move to the next frame, if I turn on onion skinning for that so we can see what the previous ones are. Now I colored the drawings, but we can see when we turn on onion skinning, sometimes it can be a little bit harder to line things up when it shows it just as a silhouette on each frame. I have locked my original image so I can just select everything, and now I can move it over. Now if I move it over using the select tool and not the animation tool, we can see that it's not putting a keyframe on the artwork. And that's really what I want to be occurring here. So now we're trying to figure out, and for doing this alignment, what it really works out to be is if I had all of the drawings that I needed, so I had more frames of animation, we could start to really line things on top of each other. As it is, we need to figure out which ones make more sense, but hedge our bets a little bit, because if I line this foot up here, and now if I move over to the next frame and select everything once more and move it over, I find sometimes while doing this it's almost easier to use the arrow keys to move things than it is to click and drag. But you can figure out which, because if I click and drag, I have to make sure that I'm keeping things in place. And what I'm doing first is showing that movement of the character, and then we'll further have to refine these to create the stationary where the character is almost slipping as part of their walk. Now, as we look through, we can see the character stepping forward. Now this one, I lined up with the wrong foot, so it needs to be adjusted a little bit more. So now turn back on onion skinning, select it, put that step out, go to the next frame, turn on onion skinning, step it out, turn on onion skinning, move it over, and with that, I now have a character. Oh, got a little, grabbed the wrong foot when I was lining up apparently. Moving forward, step.
So we were supposed to make this all one layer?
Now, moving these over, so I must have lined up with a future frame instead of a previous frame, but now we can see the frames are starting to line up. Turning off onion skinning once more. We can see the character is now walking, and it creates a cycle that with the cycle of frames, if I were to take the cycle of frames, we can now try to animate it across, but the problem I run into is now if it's a new cycle of frames, it animates that group in place, so then we have to move things over, and then that requires keyframes, and then that's a lot of work. So that's not really how we want to have it go, but in the beginning what can be useful is to try it out where we look at our core walk, and probably because we have so few frames, could modify the exposure on it. So we can extend the exposure and make it longer or shorter. So with the frames highlighted, so exposure, once all of the frames are lined up, and it creates a running or walking animation, but it creates a loop. The next thing that we need to do is get it so that it's walking in place. So the character needs to be slipping or sliding a little bit as it goes from frame to frame. If I move to the next frame and select my artwork, what we need to do is pull it back a little bit. So we're more or less going to be keying everything off of the hips. So if we look on the hips, we're starting to key off of the hips, and there can be a little kind of back and forth that occurs, but as we do this, we're locking the character in place while they animate to allow us to be able to then attach a peg, which will then make animating this character across the screen a much easier proposition. And once the frames are relatively lined up, we'll see now when the character is walking, if I pull my timing back and want to adjust my playback so it loops, we can see it appears that the character is walking. If we want, we can slow down our frames per second while we're doing this to get a better sense, and we can see that the character now appears to have a decent gait as part of their walking. So the walking using the provided template, if you slow your frame rate down to 12, or effectively keep your frame rate at 24 and double the exposure on the frames, you'll see that it creates a decent but fast walk to the animation. If we want to figure out how many extra drawings or what exposure we could do, we could slow it down to, say, 8, and that would be like having done an exposure of triple for each frame. Now we can see it's a more deliberate character walk occurring. Now, as the character is doing that, if we were to attach a peg to this drawing layer, now this peg we can very easily modify. The first thing I'm going to do is just adjust the pivot point for that peg. This is a master peg for this given layer, so it makes sense you put it at the feet. Insert and now I grab the peg for the artwork. Insert the peg with the rotation animation tool on the peg. That now sets that in place. Now I can grab my animation tool, hit F6. Now I can move my artwork over, and that inserts that. And now we can see that the character is walking. The next thing that we need to do if we want to extend this out or to work more with it is to, first I'm just getting rid of that keyframe that was there. With this series of frames, if I right click on those frames, we will see we have an option for create cycle. I can choose the number of cycles. So with this, I am going to make it 5 cycles. And now that extends that out. I can grab that keyframe and move it over to the end of my animation. We can see that now the character is walking, but they're taking too many steps for how long this animation is. So at the end of this, that means we need to be covering more ground. So if I move the legs over, then hit play, still not enough. So let's move it over some more. Hit play. Getting close. So based on the size of the steps and that number of cycles, our character needs to move further off the screen. And now we can see that the character is appearing to walk across our screen in a reasonable amount of time. Setting up the rigged character, so I have attached to the hips, I have upper leg, lower leg, and foot for a front leg, upper leg, lower leg, and foot for the rear leg. So I have those stacked. Now, I also, on the foot layer, I do have additional drawings, a bent toe and a regular foot that I can use so that the character can walk and I can rotate it as I move things forward in my animation. Now, the process for creating the cycle and setting everything up can be done very similar to what we did with the frame-by-frame animation. So we can pose our character and then adjust those poses as we start building out the animation. So we will be building it through a series of keyframes. So in order to do this, it still is nice to have the entire character, running under a peg, or at least collapsed under that layer so that I can keyframe it. So with the layer selected, I am going to add in a peg, close it out. So now that is my, it's called hips, but this one will be my rigged peg. And the other layer is going to be my frame by frame peg. So with the rigged character at frame 1, you can hit F6, insert a keyframe. Now what I can do is I can move to the next drawing and insert a keyframe to make it easy to scrub the timeline. Well, notice that that character doesn't really exist very far, and I'm even going to move that character out so that the character is starting further out in the animation. So I have my original animation, which will walk off screen and disappear, and now I will go for my rigged character, and we can stretch this out, increasing its exposure using F5. So now I have my first keyframe. Now to insert the next one, hit F6. For this, I will want to make sure to turn back on animate, and then I will want to use the transform tool, not using the select tool. The select tool will move things, and then it will be affected through every item. With my rig character, I may wish to extend it out so I can see which layer I'm working on if I want, but I don't have to. But we'll see all those keyframes have now emerged. So with my character selected, if I grab the hips, and each one of my layers, I have positioned the pivot points using the rotate tool to make sure that they will rotate consistently. I don't have to, but it makes my job infinitely easier if I do that. So now with that, if I move the character over to the next position, we can pull the hips down. And once I pull the hips down, I will see that I need to move body parts to allow for things to have enough room to show up. And we can use our shortcuts of B and Shift B to work our way up or down the food chain as we are trying to select items, or I can just click off and click on a new item. And one thing that you will find when you try and do a rigged character animation is you sometimes will need to squish and stretch the artwork as we go from keyframe to keyframe. Now as I move to this foot here, I want to go back to the other drawing, and then I can now position it. So if I go between the two drawings, we can see that the character is bending. As the hips sink, the legs have to bend to compensate for that. On the next keyframe with it, Can hit F6. Can move the hips back up, and I will need to adjust items as well. Now this keyframe we're not really doing anything with, so I'm going to clear that keyframe. I want to keep things clean. So with the hips are up. Now I need to grab my front leg, rotate it down, rotate it down, adjust the foot, repeat for the other leg, bend it, bend again, so now the character is starting to walk. Move to the next frame, insert a keyframe, move the body over, and it's just a matter of repeating the process until we have everything lined up. And we'll see that it requires, as we do things, some tweaking and adjusting as you go to get all of your parts in the arrangement that you need. And when doing it frame by frame, one thing that you will find is if you just rotate and position your elements, it will give you some degree of movement. But there will be times where you will want to introduce a little bit of squash and stretch, where you will take your different elements and stretch them. So I may want to stretch this out a little bit. Maybe not quite that much. But we can stretch it. And as it stretches, then that allows for the height so we don't have to break body parts to try to fit our basic movement cycle. Now with this, it could even, if you notice, the hips really do start to do some rotation as part of the movement that's occurring. And then we can just start cycling through until the body parts align themselves with what we need. Now it's almost feels like cheating when you have a guide that you're following to work on your animation, but it really is a useful way in the beginning when you're trying to think about it, because most of us don't, when we're building the animation, we don't think about moving the hips up and down, moving the head up and down, changing the spacing between elements, how do things bend or fold. When we have that guide to follow, it gives us more insight into what's happening. Thinking about it as we sink down and then start to reach forward, that I really want a little more pivot in the hips, which means I have to then pull the leg back just a hair and pull the leg, because as the character steps forward, we get that rotation, and then as they start to go upright, the rotation disappears. So that gives what I need for my first 5 frames, and now for the next frame I will be moving to that cycle because we don't want to repeat this frame and this frame, which will create an unsightly loop in our animation. So once again, move over, align the hips. Get the necessary rotations. Switch back to the appropriate frame that we need. Rotate back. And now we're repeating that process so that the back leg has effectively become the front leg, and the front leg is becoming the back leg. It sometimes gets a little tricky keeping track of this when you're animating, because as you look at the previous frames, okay, something broke. The colors can sometimes be a little bit off. So now as I go to this frame, I need to adjust the frame accordingly. So now the front leg is back. Front leg is now going to bend. Next frame. Move it over. And adjust your parts until you're happy with positions, rotations, and placements. And once these are situated, then what we can do is turn off the picture so it's no longer distracting us. And then when I move to the next frame, if I turn on onion skinning, we will see I get to repeat the process of lining up the hips. And this is, once again, I like to use the arrow keys as a good way to move it over. I know that keeps it perfectly lined up. Otherwise, if I start dragging, then hold down Shift, it does a similar operation. Start drag, then Shift. But you need to start dragging and keep it horizontal before you and it can be useful when you do this to create a ground plane and animate the character on the ground plane, because if you do that, then the character, you have a reference to what you're animating. So now I have sequence of keyframes, and this is where having the peg combined with the frame-by-frame animation. With my frame-by-frame animation, I can now copy these whoop, don't do that. But if I select these keyframes, the key thing about Harmony is when you copy frames, it's copying the position and artwork information on those frames. It's not copying other information, and then I will, just like before, animate the peg to make it walk across the screen. So if I copy that and paste, and paste, we'll see that we now have a walking sequence where my character is now walking with rigged animation. Then if I want the character to walk across the screen, if I just repeat the process of now hitting F6 for a keyframe out here and animate the peg itself, because I had the peg here, which I am going to, for the main peg, move that over. And now I will once again move the character. And we can see is that maybe needs to go a little faster. And that looks to be closer to what our animation holds. So to recap, after the character's been rigged, we insert frames for everything. Oh, that's what happened. This foot accidentally ended up with a bonus peg that it didn't need. So my animation is slightly wonk. We'll pretend we don't see that. There's a peg that's not doing anything. For the foot, we can see where the feet are cycling out between the different views of the foot. And now we have two versions of walking characters. I would make the argument that you have a little greater fluidity in the character when it's frame by frame. But with a rigged character, we really have more options of just moving this rig into any position. So whether the character is jumping, leaping, fighting, standing, the rig gives us those options. Frame by frame animation, I have to create additional drawings to do that versus constructing a different pose, which is going to be a little bit different.